Welcome to episode 8 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who lived in the age of Julius Caesar and wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you line by line through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem and discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. Be aware that none of us are professional philosophers, and everyone here is a self-taught Epicurean. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. Before we start with today's episode, let me remind you of our 3 ground rules. First, our aim is to bring you an accurate presentation of classical Epicurean philosophy as the ancient Epicureans understood it, and not to put our own positions into the words of the poem. Second, in this podcast we won't be talking about modern political issues. Over at the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we call this approach not Neo-Epicurean, but Epicurean. Epicurean philosophy is not a religion. It's not Stoicism, humanism, Buddhism, Taoism, atheism, or Marxism. It's a unique philosophy of its own, to be understood on its own terms, not in terms of conventional modern morality. Third, Lucretius will show that Epicurus was not focused on over-the-top luxury, like some people say, but neither did he teach a minimalist lifestyle, as other people say. Epicurus taught that feeling, pleasure, and pain are the guides that nature gives us to live by, not gods, idealism, or virtue ethics. More than anything else, Epicurus taught that the universe is not supernatural in any way. And that means that there's no life after death, and any happiness we'll ever have comes in this life, which is why it is so important not to waste time in confusion. Remember that our homepage is lucretiustoday.com, and there you can find a free copy of the version of the poem from which we're reading, and links to where you can discuss the poem with us at epicureanfriends.com. Now let's get started with today's discussion at approximately line 137 of the Latin edition, read today by Julie.
For if every being was liable to death through all its substance, snatched from our eyes, it would directly perish. No need of violence to make a breach in all its parts and loose the vital bands. But now, since all things are formed from eternal seeds, nature wills that nothing be destroyed unless some force prevails, which beats with blows its outward form or pierces through the pores with subtle art and so dissolves the frame. Besides such things as are removed by age, if time destroys them quite in all its parts, whence does the power of love restore to light the several races of beings? Whence the earth with nicest art does nourish them when born, and makes them grow, and feeds with proper food each its kind. Whence do the bounteous springs and rivers with their wandering streams from far supply the sea? The air whence feed the stars? For the vast tract of time already past had long ago consumed things that were formed from mortal seed. But if those bodies which compose this universe of things were still supplied through all that space and periods of time that passed long since, they must surely consist of an immortal nature, and from death secure can never into nothing fall. Again, the same violence would everywhere destroy all beings, if the eternal power of matter did not hold fast their close compacted frame and bonds, more strong or weak. A single touch would surely be the cause of death, for things formed out of mortal seed by any force must perish, and their frame be quite dissolved. But now, because the union of seeds of bodies differs, which consist of matter eternal in its nature, every being is safe from danger till some proper force, proportioned to its texture, makes the assault. So nothing can return to nothing. Everything resolves by separation of its parts into its principles, from whence it sprung. Lastly, the rains that Father Ether pours into the womb of Mother Earth do seem to perish there, but straight fair fruits spring up. The boughs grow green upon the trees, their limbs increase and bend beneath a load of fruit. Hence all living race of men and beasts are fed. Our gallant cities filled with youth, our leafy woods resound with songs of birds new-fledged. The weary flocks grow fat, repose their bodies on the fertile plains, while the white milky humor from their dugs distended flows. And hence their sprightly young and wanton play, frisk with their tender limbs over the soft grass, cheering their little hearts with the pure milk, and therefore things we see do not entirely die. Nature still renews one thing by another, nor does she suffer one thing to be unless supplied with matter from something else that was dissolved before. Sorry, I kind of stumbled over that.
No, you did fine, Julie.
Oh, that was great. That's a long reading.
We probably should start with putting it all in context of where we are in terms of what we've read already. Anybody want to try to do that?
Well, we've been talking about how nothing comes from nothing. Things don't just spring into being out of the void. So this section is addressing the corresponding idea that just as things don't just appear magically, they also don't vanish magically into nothing. Instead, they go into their parts. And those parts are irreducible at the smallest point, and don't go into nothingness.
And why is that significant? Why are we talking about this?
Well, you've got to cover both aspects if you want to remove the possibility of supernatural action, both coming into being and going out of being. Both of those parts have to be explained.
Yeah, that's certainly the way I see it. I think one thing going through my mind during some of our conversations online over the last week, and there was one or two posts in particular where somebody would suggest that a particular writer was an Epicurean, and they would say that this writer talked about there not being supernatural gods. But this seems to me to be an effort to back up that assertion. In other words, you can say that you're an atheist or you can have a position on gods, but it's just an assertion unless you can state the grounds for your reasoning about it. And I think largely, obviously, that's what we're doing here, that Lucretius is explaining what backs up his contention that there are no supernatural gods. That's obviously the reason we're studying the physics in the first place, to decide whether they exist or not. And we're in the middle of the proof from his point of view of how you argue that there are no supernatural beings, that the universe was not created supernaturally, it was created naturally. And these are the supporting arguments that allow him to say that he's not just being arbitrary, he's not just saying you should listen to Epicurus or you should listen to Plato. He's saying these are the arguments by which you have confidence in the conclusion.
And you mentioned that this is the reasoning. I want to say even more than that. This is evidence-based reasoning. This is observations that you can easily make yourself and see how it makes sense.
Julie, what do you think?
I mean, I agree with all of the above. I don't really have a whole lot to add yet.
Martin?
Yeah, the first two paragraphs are consistent with today's physics, so that one is no issue for me.
Well, why don't we stay with the two for just a moment then? And so, Martin, in what way do you see them as consistent?
Yeah, because what it dwells on is basically the preservation of matter and also energy, essentially. Probably the energy preservation principle is not stated explicitly in Epicurean, but it's what is stated is compatible with it.
Hey, Martin, what I was thinking about too, for those first two paragraphs, it makes me think of bodies at rest remain at rest, bodies in motion remain in motion, unless there's some interfering force. Because he says nature wills that nothing be destroyed unless some force prevails. So I think he's anticipating those principles in physics, the whole inertia issue.
I have a point to raise in those first two paragraphs, which seems to me to be slightly different than the rest of them. Most of the points seem to be observations about, or asking questions about, how does something new arise unless it comes from components that are already there. But if you look at this division at the beginning of the second paragraph, he asks the question, whence does the power of love restore to light the several races of beings? And in, Monroe says, out of what does Venus bring back into the light of life the race of living things? And Bailey says, how is it that Venus brings back the race of living things after their kind into the light of life? Or when she has, how does Earth, the quaint artificer, nurse and increase them? But is he distinguishing, do those passages imply that Venus or pleasure, is that just kind of poetic license, or does that imply what does that mean? Do you see where I'm going with that?
I think so. So, I mean, why did he bring Venus into the overall issue is that if after living, when we died, we just sort of went poof and all of the matter that made up our bodies was gone, eventually there would be, and same with plants and all other animals, eventually there would be nothing left to make living beings out of. I don't know at what point you would have consumed all the minerals and everything and not have any organic matter left. But I think he's getting at organic versus inorganic matter, possibly.
Elaine, I think where I'm going is slightly different from that. Is he implying that there's some entity separate from the matter that's being worked on?
No. I think from the preceding passages, it should be clear that he's talking about sex, procreation because of pleasure. And so you could have all the sex, procreation, so on you wanted, but if you didn't have any matter to build the fetus with, where would it come from?
I don't know if I know what you're getting at, Cassius, but it sounds like, so for example, I think they also talk about the sea, right? So like if the water just disappeared, there would have to be a continual renewing of that water. Otherwise it would just all go away, right? Is that
right.
Kind of what you're getting at? Okay. So yeah, I mean, I agree that sex would answer the question for the animals, but it's still, I mean, we have to be careful about premises, right? Because we all agree with Epicurus's position on the physical way that the universe works, but in this part of the poem, he's trying to argue to people who maybe don't already accept that why it's true, right? And so I think what he's trying to get at is that if things could just disappear, there would have to be an exhaustless source where things are coming from, and where is that, right? Otherwise, you just kind of recycle everything. So, you eat food, your body turns it into stuff you can use, and same thing with plants and, every living creature. They take, some of the matter around them and convert it into what they need it to be, rather than some other world source or something that feeding our world or something like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think by adding sex into it, I mean, this is how you get new organisms. They don't just spring into being. So he's reminding us of that. But if you don't have anything to make them out of, you still won't have them, even if you have sex. So I would hate to think that he was talking about some kind of additional force. I think that was a metaphor.
Yeah, okay, and that's exactly the point I was wanting to focus on. If, in case somebody reading this decided to maybe pick it up in the middle of reading the book and didn't know the background of Epicurean philosophy, because you could probably ask the same question about the first sentence of what is here listed as paragraph 4, where it says the rains that Father Ether pours into the womb of Mother Earth. Right. By referencing Father Ether, is he saying that there is some God who is initiating this function? And of course, that would not be the case in Epicurean.
Right. He's a poet.
Philosophy.
So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's worthwhile to talk a little bit more about the inertia aspect of this, because I think that's really cool. And when I say the bodies in motion remain in motion and the bodies at rest remain at rest, everybody knows what I'm talking about, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so that to me is what he's saying. So you would not have need of violence to make a breach in your parts. You wouldn't die if it were not for some kind of action on your life. Now he says such things are removed by age. That would be the same thing. So it's not just some kind of mysterious thing that happens that you get old. There are changes in your body and your telomeres, your body ages, but it's not a mysterious thing. And if those processes didn't happen due to environmental exposures, then you would just continue on as you are throughout time. So he's realizing that something at the particle level has to happen, where he talks about a force prevailing pierces through the pores with subtle art. Something has to happen to make matter change. I think that's really, really important.
Elaine, do you see any different point being made in the second half of this passage we're reading today, or is it basically the same point?
The last two, where, again, the same violence would everywhere destroy all beings.
Right.
I think it's very interesting that he mentioned bonds more strong and weak. I mean, they really didn't know their chemistry, but there are strong and weak bonds. Every time I see something that he couldn't have observed yet, but he just made an educated guess. It just amazes me.
What you can see is in macroscopic matter, there are also pieces which have strong cohesion. And
that's true.
By scaling the same thing down, he can conclude it from what he can experience with his regular senses.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. It's just that not everybody made that conclusion. It's just phenomenal to me. So yes, if we loosely constructed as what would be something that's very, very loosely constructed, an example.
Liquid water, wouldn't hold its shape.
Right, or a single touch would be the cause of death, something that would just break down like a dandelion. You just blow on it a little bit and it comes apart. If our bodies were like that, we wouldn't be here very long. He says a proper force proportion to its texture makes the assault. So it depends on, which kind of being you are, what it takes to break you up. If you're a turtle, you got a shell, that kind of thing, that we each take different levels and types of force to be broken apart. And if that weren't true, if we could easily all be broken apart the same, then that would be nothing returning to nothing. But he's observing that it takes different kinds of forces to break us into our components. So that's a separate point.
I see one more that I can throw in at this point of the discussion that I'm not sure we've covered explicitly in what we've said so far. At the end of the second paragraph here, which is somewhere around line 226 of the Latin, and I'm this time looking at the Monroe version, it says, "For infinite time gone by and lapse of days must have eaten up all things which are of mortal body," which, if I untangle that, I think what he's saying is that if things could go to nothing, then because time, which for purposes of this sentence, he's saying time in the past has been infinite. Mm-hmm. He's saying that things over the course of an infinite amount of time in the past, if things could go to nothing, then by now, certainly everything would have gone to nothing. There would be nothing left.
Right. Exactly. Right.
But we see that there are things that still exist, and so there must be some explanation for that. Either they have been created anew by gods from nothing, or they have come from the remnants of things that were here in the past. And the evidence is that we can see is that things don't go to nothing entirely. And so the reason things are still here and that everything hasn't disappeared into the void is that the elemental particles themselves don't ever go away.
Yes, yeah. I'm glad I saw that when we were reading it, and I almost passed it up again, but that's a critical point. So, once again, he's got a heck of a lot of information packed into these few verses. And the last paragraph is beautiful, but he is talking about the recycling of water molecules. I mean, like the movement, I guess I would say, of water molecules, that the rain comes and then the plants grow and then animals eat and so on. And so the water isn't disappearing just because we've drunk it. It's still there.
Julie, I think you and I are similar in I'm not sure that either of us has a tremendous amount of physics training. And I know that Elaine has tremendous physics training from being brought up in a family of physicists.
Don't say tremendous. It's probably what they say, half vast.
Right.
I probably think I know more than I do. So yeah.
And we know that Martin has tremendous physics
training. Martin actually knows it, right?
Because he's German, and all Germans have tremendous physics training.
Oh my goodness.
And I'm basically a third-rate accountant and lawyer, so I didn't have much physics training. And I don't know about you, Julie. Julie, do you have any physics training?
I took 2 semesters of physics in college, the end.
Yeah, I rely on Martin to tell me, Elaine, that's not right. So I'm counting on that, Martin. You better speak up if I say something out of school.
I will definitely raise my hand if something is spoken against.
Thank you. Thank you. I
Well,
appreciate that. It makes me feel safe and just spouting off because I know that you'll fix it.
yes, of course, the reason I went into that is that I think it's clear that if we attempted to unpack this against the very latest developments in theoretical physics, we would spend all of our time talking about that, and we would go into a rabbit hole that we might not ever come out of. But we probably do need to, on a generalist level, talk about, as Martin raised earlier in the conversation, that maybe there are certain parts of this that modern theoretical physics have not exactly confirmed or that they might dispute. But the point where I'm going is that for purposes of, I like to say normal people, even though I should exclude myself, for purposes of ordinary and normal people who simply are looking for a philosophy of life and needing to decide how much confidence they can have in particular arguments, we probably do need to comment on this kind of material to say whether, obviously, if when we come to some statement later in the book about the nature of lightning or the nature of magnetism or the nature of something that we just obviously have a very, very different explanation for today, we have to take that into account. But even at this level of discussing nothing from nothing and nothing to nothing, we probably ought to have a general framework of how we're looking at it. And we can differ on that. But I've always found these arguments fairly persuasive. And although I can at the same time entertain the idea that there are contrary arguments in the latest theoretical physics, I also think to myself that theoretical physics is always changing, it seems to be, but that my life is relatively short and I have to have a conclusion about how I'm going to spend it during my lifetime, just as everyone who's ever lived in the past has had to make decisions about how to live their life based on the level of evidence that they had available to them.
Yeah, so that's really the pragmatist position, right? I mean, that just come on, get done with quibbling over ridiculous things that you can never prove. I mean, it's interesting to study them, but when you come to make a decision, make your decisions based on the most obvious, reasonable information.
Yeah, but I have a comment on your mentioning of theoretical physics. It's not theoretical physics which shows or proves something or discovers something. That what they discover is just internally in the mathematical structure. What counts is experimental physics.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Experimental physics proves certain things, and theoretical experimental physics needs theoretical physics that in order to know how to set up experiments and how to interpret them. But essentially, you can completely, as a non-physicist, you can completely ignore theoretical physics and just read the explanations of what's come out of the experimental part, because at the forefront of research, theoretical physics is just speculative. It doesn't show anything what's proven. It just shows models along which we look what to refute and what we can get preliminary confirmed. And in this context, then another remark. When I said I will raise my hand if something contradicts modern physics, that is of course valid in this oral conversation. There are a couple of things written recently where I didn't take the time yet to respond. And that is the thing that if we look at the experimental data we have and extrapolate them, we certainly have something like a beginning of time, for at least for the universe as we experience it. So we need to reinterpret this, that it has eternally existed. Because the problem is, if we extrapolate back to this Big Bang, even though the Big Bang as a singularity may never have happened, still is a valid starting point for time, because before that we have simply no definition of time. We need at least two bodies to properly deal with time. And close to that singularity, distinct bodies didn't even exist. So that means there's just no time before how to define and say something about it at this point, unless, of course, one of these theoretical speculations, which could explain how through a tunneling phenomenon, this universe sprung from a previous universe, and because then it wouldn't have really had to be at that singular point, but tunnel through that in some way. And then it could be possible, based on a model like this, to possibly figure out something of what was there before. But this one, for this one, we just don't have any method yet to how to do that. So for now, the best we can say from our knowledge is that time has a beginning about 13 point something billion years ago.
So for me, Martin, that doesn't negate any of the conclusions that he made since time started. Would you say that's true?
No, yeah, also, so on the way I say for myself, this statement on this eternal existence is that compared to our direct observation span, it has basically existed like an eternal time. So it doesn't matter whether it's really eternal or just 13 point something billion years.
Right. It might as well be. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think
I don't think that should get in people's way of understanding this material, because these things about nothing coming from nothing and nothing going to nothing are true now that we are here.
Martin, one of the ways that I try to reduce this down to my own personal conclusion is to ask whether experimental physics has given us any evidence that the universe was created by Yahweh, or that there was a supernatural creation of the universe at any particular time. No. That's probably the key point, because if experimental physics did establish that there was a supernatural force at the beginning, or if experimental physics indicated that there was supernatural outside influence going on at any point in time, then guys, I'll tell you right now, I'm out of here, because I'm going to go to the temple or to the church and throw myself down and ask for that eternal life that God would theoretically provide. Because if there is experimental evidence of a God, then I want to know what's going on with that God and follow his rules so that I can get the rewards that God's offer, according to those people who tell us about them.
Right.
Yeah, but physics can neither prove or refute it, because as a starting point of physics is already the assumption that there are no supernatural forces. So the only way you can conclude that there is something like this, if you could not get any consistent results in any way. So if everything was inconsistent, I mean, it's a similar reason of what Epicurus is we just do not observe that things spring up from nothing and disappear. So if that happened, yes, this could be seen as an indication of something supernatural, because we cannot figure out any consistent laws of nature. But as soon as we figure this one out, we basically assume already, just on some preliminary observation, we then assume by our methodology as a underlying assumption there that there are no supernatural forces.
Well, you're saying that that's an underlying assumption, but it's not arbitrary. It's based on, yes.
But the way this is structured, physics can neither refute nor prove the God.
That's an interesting way to say it. Does anybody else have a comment on that way of saying it? I mean, when you are not observing the God or not observing a supernatural outside influence, is that a presumption, or is that simply your conclusion based on the evidence?
It's evidence, but so I think, to me, Martin, correct me if I'm wrong, Martin is stating it in the scientist way. You know, a fact is something that it would be perverse to say otherwise, because there's so much evidence in favor of it. But a physicist, this is not the same as a skeptic who gets all caught up in the fascination that we can never know. You know, that's a different thing. But a real scientist has to say, you know, all these things appear to be facts, but they are still up for being falsified. But supernatural, because supernatural forces by definition, not something you can observe naturally, they're not falsifiable. You can't do an experiment on something that cannot be observed. It's impossible. So it's like, who's the guy that says it's not even wrong? Because you can't do an experiment on something that has no form.
I think
Is
that
that what you're saying, Martin? Yeah. So pragmatically, it has no influence at all on how you live, because we deal in what we can actually see, and we don't have any interest in piddling with stuff that, by the own proposer's definition, can't even be observed because it's not material. So, what would you even do about that? I would just ignore it. It's meaningless.
Martin?
But one more elaboration on this one. So it's something like a self-consistency. So we assume we can find out about laws of nature, and first attempts lead to contradictions. We refine them, and it works. So that means this is a self-consistency. So someone who takes a different approach might come to a different conclusion, but it can be done in such a way that this is self-consistent, so that a God is not needed, but also is not necessarily excluded.
Right, because if there were a God, this is like some of the things Vic Stinger has said. Okay, let's say there's a supernatural God performing these actions, but when you measure it, you can explain things by just physics. Then that means the God is acting in a totally invisible way, not actually affecting the movement of the material particles. So what kind, you don't even need that God to explain it, but I guess you couldn't say there was a God that wasn't miming all the things that were going on without affecting them. I mean, it just gets to be absurd. And
well, I think that a lot of religions would adjust for what you can observe, and they would say things like God uses physics.
Yeah, but you can't distinguish between when God's using physics and when God is not. There's no God that's necessary to explain it. And so that's why it's just like this extra thing that you can't even, that they say is immaterial. So you couldn't possibly measure it. So it's out of the realm of science, out of the realm of falsifiability. It's just this made up idea. Does that make sense, Cassius?
It does. It does to me. It does to me. And Julie, I'm glad you jumped in there, because I was going to call on you. I really think that what we are trying to do is to bring into the real world of living people Epicurean philosophy and what Lucretius is trying to say here. And so what concerns me most of all is, what do we think a normal, ordinary person who's not a trained physicist or not a trained philosopher, what do we think the message that Lucretius and Epicurus would say to that person would be from all of this? How does again, I don't think we're recording these podcasts for the purposes of explaining our virtuosity, our expertise in either physics or theoretical philosophy. We're trying to be realistic and live our own lives better and more happily. And we have friends who we're going to talk to about things like this who have zero background, zero interest really in experimental or theoretical physics. So we need to be able to reduce what's being said here to something that a normal person can understand. And how is a normal person going to react to these arguments? And what should we tell them they should take away from what's being discussed here?
So I would say, from my perspective, the main point is that most things that happen in the world are predictable. Through what we have observed and through the science that we have. And it's not about whether or not gods exist or gods don't exist or anything like that. It's about, you don't have to fear that some random action is going to happen unless it's something that we have observed happens on a regular basis, right? Because that's kind of the core of Epicurean philosophy.
Yeah.
It's not about whether or not the gods exist, because Epicurus never said the gods don't exist, right?
Right.
It was just, you do not have to fear the gods. The gods aren't going to take some action and, strike you with lightning and stuff. So that to me is the core, is that everything can kind of be explained. Yes, there are there's a positive probability that you could get struck by lightning, but it's very, very small, and you don't have to act in a particular way to prevent it other than, don't go swimming when there's a lightning storm or, things like that.
Right.
You can kind of take those things into your own hands.
I think that's a wonderful point, Julie. Julie, actually, that brings up, I had an interesting conversation on physician social media this week. Yesterday, there was a question on the forum. What's your just favorite medical term? What words do you dislike the most for whatever reason? And there's a whole lot of funny, elaborate sounding medical words that people were throwing out, stuff that alliterated and so on. And I said my favorite was idiopathic urticaria, which comes from the Latin. It means basically, we don't know why you have hives. and it's the most common type of hives in children, the itchy rashes, is an unknown cause. But that doesn't mean you should keep looking for one, because we do know that it's unlikely to be allergic. Probably some of it is viral, but because it is harmless but just uncomfortable, there's more. It makes more sense to treat the symptoms and not to go looking for causes that we already know are not likely to show anything up. So like sending people to allergists and so on is likely to be fruitless. But parents get a laugh out of it. I say, well, you have idiopathic urticaria. They've gone to the whole trouble of making a Latin phrase for you have hives and we don't know why. So this doctor on social media said he hated that. He was an allergist. He said because it makes then people think the doctor's stupid and that they just haven't looked for the cause. They don't know. They're ignorant of the cause, but there is one, and they keep looking for it. And he said he preferred the European term spontaneous urticaria. And I thought, oh my goodness, I would not want to have that implies that there's some kind of almost supernatural thing going on here, that there isn't a cause. Rather than saying we don't know what the cause is, spontaneous, it's like, oh, it just happens. And that, I think, is the wrong message to send patients. It's okay to tell them that some things happen. We know that there is a cause, but we don't yet know what it is. But by the way, it's not harmful. We can help you with the symptoms. Versus, it's almost like spontaneous combustion. You could just be walking around and suddenly burst into flames or suddenly break out in hives, and there isn't a cause. It sounds a lot scarier to me. So your point about saying, make your observations. Things are predictable. They don't just happen out of the blue. Sometimes we don't know why, but they're not happening supernaturally for no reason.
That's an excellent point about spontaneous versus idiopathic. I have never considered that before, but the choice of words that you're getting into there, I completely agree with what you just said.
And I also feel better about when I randomly just have hives. Just kidding.
And to stay on that for just a moment, as far as spontaneous goes, I've never thought about that word in that context, but I think you're right. The word spontaneous implies some weird external cause, some weird, almost like you say, supernatural. It's
or
spontaneous.
like it just happened out of nothing.
Out of
like
nothing,
an action
right?
Coming out of nothing. It can't be that way.
Because spontaneous combustion, there are people who talk about people
I know
bursting into flames. I've heard that. I don't know where the source of that kind of thing comes from, but
okay, here it is. It says from the late Latin root spontaneous, willing or of one's free will. So of course we use it a lot for unplanned or impulsive, but it would be like the hives came of their own free will, that they just they could just happen whenever. Your body could just freely decide to burst into flames for no reason. And that's not happening, because changes in matter, just as he says here, have to have action on them. Nature wills that nothing be destroyed unless some force prevails, right? And also the same thing with something happening. You have to have some kind of action of the particles, or it's not going to happen. And that just doesn't start up on its own.
It might not be going too far to say that that's what all this physics is about here, that things do not happen spontaneously. They happen because of pre-existing forces that arise from the elements themselves, not from supernatural forces, but from the elements and their movements.
Right.
Martin, do you have any comment on spontaneous and implications of that word?
Yeah, so I understand your point on it, but it doesn't imply it necessary. As a physicist, I have no problem with it because radioactive decay is spontaneous in that sense. But and this was also where I was first a bit stumbling on the third paragraph here. But meanwhile, I've thought about it, and the force which drives this is actually in case of nucleus, that we have the repulsive forces there, and that this radioactive nucleus is unstable. No? So that means there exists a force. It's just it happens spontaneous in the sense that it's randomly distributed in time when it happens. No?
So I don't think that's spontaneous in the way, though, that it's not the same kind of spontaneous that people are thinking about when they're saying it happens for no reason. I mean, there is still a reason for the decay. It's not just uncaused. And when a layperson is saying spontaneous, like spontaneous combustion, they're talking about like nothing happened and suddenly you're on fire.
Right. And taking things back to the lay level is really what we ought to always strive to do. But go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, actually I was done already.
Okay. All right.
But I mean, are you agreeing with me? I mean, it's not just the decay is not just unexplainable, but there are reasons for it.
Yeah, we just cannot, for an individual nucleus, we cannot predict the time when it happens.
Yeah, and I think that's a different thing from things happening for no cause whatsoever, no reason. So we'd want to emphasize to people that there are reasons for things, there are causes for events that are not supernatural.
Just like in the end of our discussion today, as we begin to probably close, we can go on indefinitely talking about different writers and different theories, different experiments, different observations, and we can never really get to the point of saying, well, where are we going to end up? What are we going to rely on for our conclusion? At the end of the day, where do we stop? We have to eventually eat. We have to eventually go to sleep. We have to resume our normal daily activities. We can't constantly fill our minds with speculations about the origins of the universe. So where do we stop? Where do we rest our confidence and put it on the shelf and say, this is where I resolve this question at the moment, and this is how I'm going to live my life? Because I can't live my life constantly reading book after book after book on physics. And I think Epicurus was telling us that it's important to realize that in the end, the conclusion we need to be comfortable with and be confident of is that there are not supernatural forces outside of nature which are threats to us. And I think we've talked about threats a lot today, but also they don't reward us either. There's not going to be a life after death and therefore a reason to attempt to live our lives in conformity with the rules of a particular religion, because the evidence just does not support that. In the end, when we look out the window, things don't disappear to nothing. Things don't come from nothing. Our daily existence appears to us in every way to be consistent with atoms and void changing positions and the rules of nature that Epicurus has been discussing.
Yeah, and I think that's the pragmatist position. There's no need to say that we're making any kind of absolute pronouncement. And even if Epicurus was, there's no reason to say that you have to say that to be an Epicurean and to follow these principles as the most pragmatic, reasonable, really the only thing we have access to. We don't have access to information that can't be observed. And so why bother with it?
Elaine, you're using the word pragmatic several times, and I think it's
Yes.
worth commenting on that. I personally wonder if some people, again, I'm my standard theoretical, normal, ordinary person, may have a derogatory meaning in their mind about the word pragmatic, or they may have
Really?
some people may. I think that pragmatic is frequently contrasted with principled. Julie,
Oh, you're talking about like political, yeah.
yeah, Julie, you're the sounding board for normal and ordinary person. Does pragmatic have any negative connotation in your mind?
It doesn't in my mind, but I don't know that I get to be that person. But yeah, no,
Right.
Okay. Well, that's good to know.
Probably none of us, Cassius, none of us are normal. But
But you know where I'm going,
let's just
Elaine.
face it. Yeah,
Right.
I don't know. We could poll our members. We could ask them, how does the word pragmatic strike you? It's true that probably most people don't know what philosophical pragmatism is, but I think it had not come around in Epicurus' time. It was after him. I can't imagine that he would have had an argument with it, but it's exactly the kind of thing that you say constantly. It's just, when are we going to stop, twiddling around with stuff that's unprovable and unresolvable, and decide, okay, what does this mean about the decisions that I'm going to make today in my day-to-day life? Am I going to base that on observable phenomena or imaginary things?
Yeah, let me say it one other slightly different way. I
Okay.
think that some people, when they use the word pragmatic, they are implying that they are settling for pragmatism. They're implying that, well, I don't have X, Y, or Z absolute knowledge, so therefore I'm going to settle for the knowledge that I do have. And I think that's what I would like to bring home as probably not the way to look at it, because you're looking at pragmatism.
No.
Right.
Pragmatism means, what can you use? What's usable.
But does it necessarily imply that you would like to have more, or does it tell you that you're?
No, it doesn't mean that you would like. It means, now it does to a certain extent mean that you admit that some things are not testable. Like if somebody tells you that there is a thing that exists that can't be measured or observed, then they've immediately said you can't test it, so you can't even talk about that question, really. So it doesn't mean that that's not an issue, but it means that it's irrelevant, and that it's irrelevant, and so you're going to go ahead and take action. I don't see it as it's like a cave, or it's like settling. It's like saying, what you're talking about there is ridiculous. It's more a criticism of idealism, in my opinion, than a cave.
I completely agree with you. I think that there are, again, it's a question of who we're talking to, who's listening to the discussion and so forth. I think people who, the more training and education and scientific background they have, the more comfortable they are with what you've just said, Elaine. Those people who've had less of that, at least in my personal background, they are often thinking, they run into people who say, I am absolutely certain of this because God said so, or I'm absolutely certain because it's in the Bible, it's right here. And so they think that an argument that's not based on what God said, or an argument that's not based on what's in the Bible, is inherently inferior because, well, you're just looking at your own experience, but I'm looking at the Bible, or I'm looking at what Einstein said, or they're using, and not to be critical of Einstein, obviously, but they're using an authority argument, or an argument that's based on something other than experimental observation. And so we're just constantly going to run into the issue of, are we inherently coming from a position of weakness because we're just basing our conclusions on our own observations, or on observations in general? Is observational reasoning inherently inferior to religion or idealism of the Platonic kinds? Obviously, I think I have my own answer to that question about whether it's inferior or not, but I think that probably a significant number of people who would come across Lucretius and Epicurus are going to be searching for answers to questions like that.
Yeah. So, I think that's a complicated answer, but there are the kinds of people who are going to stick to, by the time they get to adulthood, this is true because it's in the Bible. are not likely to be listening to our podcast, and are not likely people who are going to be interested in being Epicureans. But I think that the importance of getting down to the fundamentals of what we're going to agree on appears to be going on in the universe is that the humanists,
Right.
the people who are not supernaturalists, but who have decided that there can be such a thing as absolute virtue and absolute ethics. And those people are not proposing that there's a supernatural. So we're really not even having to make that argument. But what we are having to remind them is that there's no, like virtue particle or anything out there to underpin their assertion that there are absolute virtues. That is where I think we could maybe make the most headway.
Julie.
Well, just on the point that Elaine just finished making, I'll say that that there's no reward for virtue outside of pleasure, right?
Right. Yeah.
I guess I don't have much more to add. There was one point I wanted to make on something you said earlier, Cassius, and it's not really important to the discussion we're having here, but just in case there's anyone listening who's, kind of on the fence and just listening to arguments, I just wanted to point out that the argument around whether or not there are supernatural beings, with any sort of punishment or reward system. I just want to point out that what we're talking about today with the physics is an important part of that argument, but it's not the entire argument. Because I think somebody could listen to this entire podcast and go, oh, well, that's not a strong enough argument to prove that, there are no gods that, are trying to punish us or anything like that. And that's not the entirety of the argument. I just want to point that out.
Yeah.
You're right. We certainly can't go into the details of the rest of the argument, but just in case somebody hears you say that, what are the categories or what direction are you referring to?
Well, I think is it principle doctrine number 1, where they're basically saying, if you define something as a divine being, that implies no anger and no gratitude, right? And a reward or punishment would require that the God was either, angry with you or felt gratitude for some reason. And
you're saying you come to the same conclusion through a different argument apart from the physics.
I'm saying I think that this second part is an important part of the argument, and that the physics alone may not convince people that they don't need to fear the gods or any god by itself.
Because of the nature of the gods through anticipations telling you that gods are perfect, and so therefore you would not expect a perfect and self-sufficient being to be concerned about regulating the lives of ants and other people and other things that are irrelevant to them.
Yes.
Elaine?
Yeah, I think we need the whole picture. We're going to go through the whole poem eventually. And so I think we can't just make one argument. That's why the book is long. So,
absolutely. I just wanted to point out for anybody listening to this particular podcast that that's not the end of the argument.
Right. Yes, I think that's really important. I'm agreeing with you.
You constantly are going back and forth in Epicurean philosophy, it seems like, from the outline level to the details and back again. And in fact, that's what Epicurus specifically advised in the letter to Herodotus, that you don't always need to be referring to the details as long as you keep the outline level in your mind. And clearly what you're talking about the nature of a perfect being is one of the higher level conclusions that does come from a different manner of reasoning about them, but is consistent with the detail level as well. That's got to be the way that outlines and details fit together. They have to be consistent, but they're not necessarily, you just don't constantly have to refer back to every detail while you're talking about the higher level conclusions.
Right. I agree.
Martin, we probably ought to start to wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty much out of any more comments, so
I think this has been this has been a good discussion today, I think. All of them.
I think so too.
This is a particularly good one.
All right. Well, I hope y'all have a good week, and I look forward to next week.
Absolutely. Yep.
Me too. Thanks, everybody. We'll do it again next week.
Yep.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.